Welcome everyone to this discussion where our aim will be very modest. We will restrict ourselves to discussing and solving all the problems of humanity for the next 1,000 years or so. I welcome to the panel Patrick Deneen, professor at the University of Notre Dame. You're a political scientist, and your claim to fame is a book that you wrote, Why Did Liberalism Fail? That raised some eyebrows and initiated a lot of discussion. Radek Sikorski, it's the Polish pronunciation. I don't think he invented the helicopter. And I've just learned that the first time he came to Hungary was in 1971. And you, at that time in communism, you came to Lake Balaton to have a good time. Campsite, and you preferred Balatonfüred, is what I understand.
It was nearby.
Near Balatonfüred, okay. But we all know Radek Sikorski has been a Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs. You've been an accomplished journalist, even a war correspondent. But I think his real relevance in the global conversation is due to simply that you inspire ideas. And I remember the time when he demanded that Germany embrace its duties and its growing weight internationally and show some leadership. Have they?
That was at the time of the Euro crisis, and they didn't enough. They did just enough at the very last moment, which I think prolonged the financial crisis unnecessarily. I think the Greek crisis could have been shorter if Germany, Angela Merkel, had intervened more decisively. And of course, they should have provided more leadership in facing up to the Putin invasion of Ukraine, and they haven't.
All right, and before we get into the thick of the debate, your wife is also a very influential figure in the global conversation, historian Anne Applebaum. Do you inspire each other when you talk in the kitchen?
And the recipient of the Pettoffi Prize.
And the recipient of the Pettoffi
As well as
Prize.
the Pulitzer. So yes, we over the kitchen table we talk history, politics, geopolitics.
Are there ever any intellectual fights between you?
We mostly agree, but not always. But you know, in that sense, I was grateful to President Trump because just at the time when the Polish nationalist right took over power in Poland, then very shortly afterwards, Mr. Trump, so if he hadn't won, I would have heard all the time how terrible Polish politics was. And as it was, we were able to sympathize with each other about the wave of populism sweeping the entire Western world.
Populism, very bad, very bad. So, Professor Deneen, we live in times of bitter political...
Aren't you going to ask me about my wife?
Go on.
She prefers to live in a screen of anonymity.
And then I'll tell about my wife. Anyway, so we live in times of bitter political strife between what we call the left and the right, conservatives, liberals, globalists, regionalists. Will that ever stop? And if so, who's going to win? Will the future be conservative, regionalist, or globalist, and left or liberal?
So it's interesting to think about the origins of this, these labels of left and right. Of course, it goes back to the period before and after the French Revolution, when the French Assembly is divided between the revolutionaries on the left and the party of the aristocracy on the right. And so what are the features of the traditional left? The traditional left was the party of the people. It was the party against privilege and status, the party against the elites, the party against the wealthy. The right was, of course, were the defenders of wealth, of status, of position. They were the party of the elites, the old aristocracy. So when we ask whether the future is left and right, it's interesting to think about where we are now. We still use these labels, but they don't seem to describe something that's quite reflects the reality of our world today. I jotted down before I came down. I jotted down a few notes from a very interesting study that was done by Bloomberg just before the 2020 election of donors to Donald Trump and to Joseph Biden. So these aren't just voters. These are people who opened their wallets to donate money to these two men, to the campaigns of these two men. So these are the most intense supporters of the political parties. And so they divided up the study by organizations that, or employees of various organizations, and then professions. So I'll just give you an idea of what the findings were. The largest percentage of contributors to Joe Biden by organization were Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Disney, JP Morgan, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and so on.
Maybe the algorithm found out he liked them.
It might have, but I think these people this was who they supported. By contrast, I'll just give you the Trump professions. Here are the professions, the largest percentage of donors by profession to Donald Trump. Electricians, truckers, construction workers, mechanics, plumbers, and the highest percentage, stay-at-home mothers.
Yeah, what about Koch brothers and other billionaires?
I'm just saying, I'm saying people, employees, who took out money from their wallets and contributed. So this is all to say that when we speak of left and right, we need to understand that in some ways, the position of the left and the right have really changed in the contemporary world. The status of those who are more likely to support the candidates have changed. So when we ask about whether the future is left and right, maybe history at least can be a little, it can be a little bit instructive, which is that we know that those who run the country, the elites, those who run its main institutions, can stay in power for a very long time. And they are very willing and able to do so. And even potentially against the will of the people. This is, of course, the lesson of revolutions and throughout recent history. But that can't happen indefinitely. So I think that we're likely to see an oscillation, a continuing oscillation, but this division is probably only going to deepen unless there is an ability for these, in some senses, for these two classes to find some way to reconcile each other. And that, at the moment, doesn't seem to be very likely.
You don't need any encouragement to answer to that.
Well, I don't think I agree with the professor, because under President Trump, we did have a huge corporate tax cut. And under Biden, he's trying to impose a minimum tax on corporation of 15%, including the tech giants who should be paying taxes somewhere. Now, as regards the ideological division, I think it's very important, and I hope Patrick will agree, that we define our terms, because we use some words differently on two sides of the Atlantic. The way I see it is that after the three utopias of the 20th century, fascism, communism, and theocracy, we now have a struggle between more traditionally minded people and more progressively minded people, who in the United States are called liberals, and it's confusing. When I use the term liberal, I mean something much narrower. For me, liberalism doesn't have any political content. It's just a set of rules, or rather prohibitions on how to manage the political scene so that we don't tear ourselves apart. So liberalism for me is rule of law. That if we agree certain things, we stick to the arrangements. Liberalism for me is, if you win an election, that doesn't mean you can do anything you want. There should still be a civil service, there should still be an independent judiciary, there should still be public media that tell the truth, and so on. And so I think the liberalism is about managing power. Who takes decision and by what procedure, so that they become legitimate. And in that sense, we have the normal competition of ideas between traditional ideas and more forward-looking ideas in their view, between ideologies. People need meaning in their lives. They need cosmology, they need religion, they need ideology, and they would like to impose them on others. Liberalism is a means of allowing people to change society legitimately through a democratic process. That's how I understand it. And in that sense, it'll never end. In that sense, I think Fukuyama was right, that liberalism, thus understood, plus the free market, is the most successful system, because would you rather live in Russia? Would you rather live in China? Would you rather live in Iran? Or would you rather live in Denmark or in the United States? Or in places where liberal procedures are respected? Because liberalism allows for mistakes to be corrected, and authoritarian or ideologically driven systems don't.
Well, actually, the north of Tehran is quite nice. Have you been there?
Yes, I have, and I'm telling you, de gustibus non disputandum est, but I wouldn't.
Full of liberal people. Anyway, I take this moment before we get back to you, in case anyone wonders why I'm not wearing a jacket. I got into heavy rain 2 times today. Were I wearing my jacket, I would be dripping, so I chose not to. Professor Deneen, but liberalism failed, didn't it? Or are we talking about 2 different things here?
Well, I think we're talking about the same thing. We simply see it rather differently. So the question was, what is the future? Is the future liberal or conservative, left or right? And I was hoping to, in some ways, make complex or more complex the question of left and right. But of course, this maps, left and right maps onto, we could say, liberal and conservative. But I just wanted to correct the idea that somehow, when we say conservative, what we mean is some kind of defense of the old privileged society. I think, in fact, what today liberalism and those who defend liberalism are actually, this is the new aristocracy. The new aristocracy is defending its position, and it's defending its position behind a kind of mask of neutrality. And we just heard that. We just heard the explanation of this mask of neutrality, that liberalism has no content, that it's empty of any set of commitments, and that it simply sets the rules of the game. But like every aristocracy, the rules of the game tend to favor those who run the show. And I think we see that around the world in the liberal democracies of the world, which is that we have a growing bifurcation between those who are successful, those whose lives are flourishing, and those who are sinking in their respective societies. And it should not be the case that whether or not you work for Apple or Google or Facebook, or if you're a mechanic or an electrician or a plumber, that your life prospects, not just your wealth, but whether or not you can form a family, and whether or not you can pass on something that you believe, and whether or not your society is stable, and whether or not you have expectations that the future looks in some ways similar to your present. This is really the titanic battle that's happening. And those who tend to defend liberalism, and I don't know you well, but I hear some of this, tend to want to defend a system that has been organized in such a way in which the people who are able to live a world largely without the kinds of, let's say, the traditional arrangements of society, they flourish. And those who, in some ways, are bereft of those traditional organizations of society, they sink. And this is why I find the defense of liberalism, as I write in my book, liberalism has failed because it has succeeded. It's not that it's failed in doing what it wanted to do. It's done what it wanted to do very well. But it's failed because those, in some ways, who argue that it was beneficial to all people, in fact, have been shown and revealed to be much like the old aristocracy, which is that they serve their interests behind a shroud of a new kind of noblesse oblige, which is that we work on your behalf when in fact they seem to be working on their own behalf. Let's
allow Mr. Sikorski to answer to that before we get to the next topic.
Sure. I share some of the diagnosis on failures. I think we have allowed our societies to become too unequal. And I think it's partly because the financial industry has become too big a part of the economies of some countries. For example, Wall Street is too big in the United States, and it overwhelmingly votes Republican. So you have your billionaires too. And I think we mismanaged globalization. And all of us, we made certain bets, that China would liberalize its economy, that globalization would in due course help everyone. And globalization helped poor people in poor countries, but harmed poor people in rich countries. And we need to redress that. And the liberal order with its alternation of power is capable of doing that. Now, you mentioned conservatism, and I think here we also need to be precise. Because here in Europe, I don't know about Hungary, but certainly in Poland, hardly anybody who calls himself a conservative, I would call him a conservative. So for me, like for you, conservatism is not the defense of an old order. Conservatism is a temperament to be suspicious of political enthusiasms, of too rapid a change, of ideologies. People who call themselves conservatives tend to be either religious fundamentalists or national socialists or kind of traditionalist revolutionaries who'd like to bring back some kind of order from the past that probably never was, but are willing to wreck society in the chase for that utopia. And in that sense, conservatism, suspicion of enthusiasms, and liberalism, respect for rules, are actually perfectly compatible. And I share your frustrations with some American progressives who have made the life of people at many universities unbearable with their pursuit of ideological conformity, for example. But I put to you that we have similar tendencies on the right too. I'm Polish. We've just had our justice minister has just proposed a draft law which envisages 2 years in jail for mocking the dogmas of established religions. Now, wokeness is a sort of lynch mob that is actually not legally based, mostly. It's just people, it's a series of witch hunts. This is an attempt to actually punish people with criminal law for questioning religious dogma. Come on.
I think we could go on along these lines for quite a time. You two get on wonderfully in terms of the dynamics of the conversation. And although I think a number of people here would not recognize themselves in your description of conservatism, I propose we continue this line of conversation, but let's focus on the European Union. You're a member of the European Parliament. Let me ask you an easy question. Will the European Union be a de facto state in the future? If so, can it be democratic, or will it weaken over the past few decades?
Well,
maybe Mr. Deneen, you go first.
Sure.
Maybe Mr. Deneen should go first because you just spoke. Okay. Let's let him.
He's the member of the European Parliament, right? So you should speak. I suppose you really should speak.
I'm happy to.
Yeah, I'm sure. I would say the following. To pursue the idea of being a European nation would mean, I suppose we would have to define our terms, but I suppose what that would mean is that from Brussels, the European Parliament would be empowered to make uniform and universal laws that would apply regardless of sort of domestic national situations in every respect. That, like any national legislature, it would be the sovereign. It would have the final word. And if we look today, to go back to the example of what's happening in the United States, if we look today at the United States, and what sometimes is now called a cold civil war that's occurring in the United States, much of, and I'm not going to say all of, but much of the division that's taking place in American society has been as a consequence of the effort to impose a universal and homogeneous law upon all of the states of the Union, increasingly through a very activist federal government. And it can be liberal, it can be conservative, but half of the country generally finds itself to be unhappy when a blanket set of laws is passed, or our judiciary makes a finding in which a blanket set of decisions are passed. And I'll give you the example, a very controversial example, but the decision of 1973 of Roe versus Wade, that, just to be clear, in case you're not aware of what the actual decision was, the decision was it made it, in a sense, it made it no longer legal, no longer legitimate for a state, one of the American states, constitutive states, the United States, to pass limitations, certain limitations on abortion up to a certain time, which over time became really a kind of blanket, it became the most permissive abortion regime in the world, I think outside of China. So there was a blanket decision that was made that applied to all states, even states that were not persuaded that this was the right decision to take. And if anyone has paid attention to American politics over the last 50 years or so since that decision, this has roiled our country. It is one of the most divisive issues in our country.
So what you're saying is the EU shouldn't go down that road.
So if you, in some ways, this is exactly what I'm saying. I'm sorry if I speak too long, but I think the point needs to be made that Europe, if anything, has much more distinctive, right? These are not just individual states, these are nations that have thousands of years history behind them, with different languages, different traditions, different religious traditions. The United States was much more similar at the time of its founding than Europe is today, than the constituent nations of Europe are today. So if Europe wants to avoid a future in which its future is defined by these kinds of intense political divisions that are likely to lead to the dissolution of the European Union altogether, it would be to avoid anything like the effort to create a kind of universal and homogeneous European state.
So sometimes less is more. Mr. Sikorski, how do you see it?
I actually agree. We don't need to make uniform laws on everything. We should stick to the principle of subsidiarity, which is that decisions should be taken at the lowest possible level, closest to the citizen. And we don't need a uniform law on abortion, for example. Poland has just passed a law which is tougher on abortion than the Islamic Republic of Iran. In Poland, you can't conduct abortion even if the fetus is terminally damaged. So when they now have twins, before they would damage, they now allow both the fetuses to die. And of course, that would be anathema to Holland or Denmark or Britain. Well, Britain no longer with us, but you know what I mean. But to come back to your question, the United States started as a confederation. When they were fighting the British, you were under Articles of Confederation. And it wasn't satisfactory. General Washington really hated it because states promised troops and ammo and they didn't arrive on time. So when they won with the British, they made a deal, a constitutional deal, to strengthen the center and to create a federation. And the kind of point of no return, the famous Hamiltonian moment, was when they decided that they would assign joint taxes to service war-era debt, and in return, the capital will be in Virginia. And then there was still the issue of whether you could leave the federation, and that was decided by civil war. We are not at that stage. We are a confederation, definitely. You can leave, the British have just proven, and ultimate power is still with the member states. So if a member state doesn't want to do something, it can defy Brussels. It can, and you know, Poland, for example, is paying €1 million a day penalty for not abiding by a judgment of the ECJ. They can charge us this money.
Is it not a stupid judgment? About coal, right?
No, it's not. No, it's not.
Two judgments.
No, it's not. It's not about coal. That
one
one
about the justice system, then.
Yeah, about the justice system. It's very important to have an independent judiciary. That's not a stupid issue. And once you voluntarily subscribe to a set of treaties, they become national law. These are our laws that are being broken. You can disagree, but the point is that you can only make a further treaty that takes us somewhere else by consent. No new European treaty would be made without national parliaments agreeing to it. Hungary and Poland joined together the European Union. We knew it was a political union. We signed up to making the euro our currency. We signed up to having the ECJ as the adjudicator of the European system. And we further signed up to voluntarily to the Lisbon Treaty. And we ratified it in our parliaments. Our presidents have signed it. So these are our laws. And should we go further? It depends. I believe that some things should remain forever in the purview of the member states. Everything to do with public morals, education, national identity, religion, all those things that are to do with national identity should forever. You know, the French have not ceased to be French, the Spaniards are still Spaniards, and we want to remain Poles and Hungarians. But the people of Europe are now saying, after the pandemic, should we really be again dependent on China for respirators and masks and active ingredients of our medicaments? Or should we have some European standard and some storage of emergency stuff to be sent to the member state that needs it? Or, in the wake of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, I mean, the Americans have rallied around this time, I think partly because President Biden mishandled the withdrawal from Afghanistan. But what if next time they are tied up with China, with Taiwan, and they can't help us? People of Europe are saying we want a European defense worthy of its name. And I tend to agree, actually.
It was descriptive what you have just said, but if you were to put money, do you think the European Union will be a federal state some way down the road? Or that will never happen?
Well, look, we've just done what was almost unthinkable 10 years ago. All of our governments, including the government of Hungary, have signed up to a joint mortgage for 30 years.
Common tax.
No.
Common debt
no,
brings common tax down the road.
Yeah, you might be right. We have not taken a marriage vows, certainly not sacramental marriage vows, but we have taken a mortgage together, and those things bind together, don't they? So for 30 years, we are jointly and severely responsible for one another's debt. And we have an interest in creating a tax on financial transactions or on the big corporations to service that debt from that tax rather than from increased contributions, right? That creates a tendency to collaborate more closely together. I agree with you. But we have not made the Hamiltonian moment.
So may I just respond? Again, I'll bring the American example, since we've been mentioning the constitutional agreement, which is quite correct, that it was the effort to create more coordination between what were until that time sovereign states. At the time of that agreement, there was a very pitched debate, however, about how and in what ways the central government could be prevented from accumulating powers, which it was feared it would be likely to do. That once you gave it the power to raise armies, to tax, and so forth, that there would be a tendency, and there were those who were very worried about the Constitution, that there would be a tendency within the Constitution over time, not immediately, over decades and over hundreds of years, to accumulate more power in the center. And this would often take the form of either a response to an emergency, and in which, after the emergency and emergency powers were taken, those powers would never be relinquished. or it would be done through or let's say, quasi-democratic means, especially through the judiciary. And in fact, there's one of the critiques of the Constitution which predicts the judiciary will overstep its authority by emptying the states of their sovereignty. I think you can already see evidence that this confederation, that there are those who lead the confederation who would like to move the confederation in a similar direction. And I think you see this in the way in which the European Union, and especially the European courts, treats this nation, treats Hungary, on issues that I think arguably are under its sovereignty. Questions of how you teach children, what's permissible to teach children, how one manages one's borders, and so forth. And to see the kind of aggressive use of European courts to rein in the sovereignty of this nation, I think is a repetition of exactly the things that worried those who were concerned about this tendency of the American Constitution. And I would simply say to the European leadership, to a member of parliament, if you don't want to run into the same kind of division that will potentially split apart or create a kind of cold civil war, there needs to be respect for the sovereignty of the individual nations, even when the elites of that society may not agree with the views and the positions of that sovereign nation.
I see you partly shaking your head, partly nodding, and I will give you a chance to reply.
Sure,
but after that, we move on to the war in Ukraine.
Well, I would just say that in Europe, the European Union is only responsible for spending about 1% of the GDP of Europe, of the member states, number one. And number two, the cost of managing that budget is 5% of the money. So it's a very frugal system. I agree that judges can overstep their authority and you can have too much of a good thing. But in Europe, we have expressly founded the ECJ as an arbiter of the single market and of the disputes between member states and European institutions. In the United States, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Supreme Court gave itself the right to review legislation. It's not in the Constitution, is it?
Hamilton argued it was implied.
Right.
And it turns out that those who want to centralize can always find something that's implied.
All right, let's move on to Ukraine. Maybe you, Mr. Sikorski, I think you have worked out two strategies how to deal with Russia in the course of your career as a politician. Are we at the beginning of World War III? Are we entering an era of wars? How will this conflict change Europe and the world?
Well, we might be. I mean, President Putin is talking about re-establishing the Soviet Union. His defense minister has just repeated it. So we don't know who else they will attack. It's they attacking their peaceful neighbors, not the other way around. And it's very serious because let's remember how the Second World War started. It started by the Chancellor of Germany saying, I need to unite all the Germans under one political authority. That was the justification for the Anschluss of Austria, and it was the justification for the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, and it was then, through the Gleiwitz provocation, also the pretext for the attack of Poland. And we have created a taboo after the Second World War, that protecting your national minorities is not a sufficient reason, a casus belli, for war. This is why we have the Council of Europe, created by the British, with its conventions on the rights of national minorities. We have problems with national minorities all over Europe, everywhere. I was just in the Dolomites. The Italians call it Alto Adige, the Germans call it South Tyrol, right? And there are plenty of such places in Europe. If we started invading one another in order to protect the national minority on the other side, we would again be at war, all of us, with everybody else. So if you feel that your compatriots are unfairly treated, you start an infringement procedure in the Council of Europe. They send experts, the experts make recommendations, and then you demand of the neighboring country to respect those judgments. And it sometimes works, not always, but sometimes works. You don't send the tanks. That is completely verboten.
You mean Russia should be a member of the European Union, and then
Russia
there would be an
is a member of the
procedure
Council.
against Moscow?
Russia is a member of the Council of Europe, as is
like
Ukraine. So there is a mechanism for at least coming to a judgment of what the reasonable arrangements would be. Respect for local languages. So in Alto Adige, you have street signs in 3 languages, and everybody rubs along. You have 3 languages in schools. Fine.
But we know that the reason for war is never the reasons that are given. It's not about minorities. So, Mr. Deneen, Professor Deneen, excuse me, how do you see it? Are we entering a period of prolonged warfare in Europe? What's to be the end of it?
Well, if I could tell you the answer to that, I'd be probably very wealthy. I think they call it the fog of war for a reason. And war, of course, is unpredictable. So it could be that on the horizon there is an escalation of some type, and it can be just by an accident. Somebody crosses a border by, just unintentionally, or perhaps intentionally, or something is done through propaganda means, blaming something on somebody which was actually said. So all kinds of possibilities. But let me at least introduce something that I think is too often overlooked, which is often in these kinds of settings, we elites, and I'm an elite, and you're an elite, and you're an elite, even if you're not wearing a jacket, you're an elite.
I come from a communist housing estate in the city of Bydgoszcz.
I'm from a working class neighborhood. We're all working men, but nevertheless, we are. Let's just stipulate we have certain advantages, and we can sit here and talk about what we think should be done with some reasonable expectation that it might happen. Because we tend to have influence, we elites tend to have influence within the corridors of power with those who make the decisions of whether to send troops in or whether to send in bombs and so forth. But as we know, and as we certainly know from recent history, whether or not a war will be prolonged and extended and prosecuted for a long period of time will depend on the mood of the population of the country that is prosecuting the war. And this is, of course, true for Russia. But it's also true for the United States, and it's true for the countries of Europe. And initially, what we saw was there was a fair degree of alignment between the opinion of the elites, of those who were, in some ways, in the position of saying what our response should be. So very early after the invasion, there was a strong amount of support for U.S. support and U.S. expenditure, significant expenditure of funds, U.S. tax dollars, to arm and to train Ukrainian troops. But as the war has gone on, and obviously its costs, literal costs, have come home, have begun to pinch the citizenry, we're seeing a growing divergence between the views of the people who would be really responsible for a prolongation of the war and those who would be likely to encourage its continuation. Again, I don't have a crystal ball, but I would say, at least from the US perspective, it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because there is a growing divide, a partisan divide, over the war in terms of whether there's support or no support. And I can give you at least a little bit of a recent opinion poll. This is from June. Overall support for the war. Now, if I look at CNN and Fox News and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, it's 100%. Those who are in charge of the elite institutions and of the newspapers, they are strongly in support of supporting and arming Ukrainians. At its height, 55% of the US population said they were either strongly or moderately in support of arming and supporting, and they called it a open-ended support of Ukraine. However, that percentage has dropped closer to 50%, but here's what's really interesting. In June of this year, 69% of Democrats expressed this support. 47% of Republicans expressed this support. Now, we know in all likelihood Republicans will win back the Congress in a few months, and that may or may not impact the executive branch's powers over foreign policy. But it will impact whether or not Congress would be likely to spend money. And I think you're going to see a pulling back of the willingness of the Republican Party to be open-ended in its support of Ukraine. And this is likely, I think, potentially likely to force some kind of beginnings of some kind of peace resolution, which will have to come, it seems to me, from the American side. That America will have to intervene if it's not going to have an open-ended support for the war.
Actually, Prime Minister Orban has said this will be over when the US and Russia come to some sort of agreement. Do you see any truth in that?
This war will be over when Putin realizes that he can't conquer Ukraine. I was in Washington 10 days ago, and I was very impressed by the agreement in the elites, Republican and Democratic elites, but including supporters of former President Trump, Senator Johnson, for example, and others, for helping Ukraine defend itself. They basically see it as a way of warning China off attacking Taiwan, and I think that's correct. The package of American assistance, $40 billion, that's already been voted through, is the largest in history. So if this money reaches, and the equipment reaches the battlefield, I think the Ukrainians have a chance. The Russians attacked with too small a force. They are demoralized. They don't seem capable of doing, a big offensive. Wars end either by one side winning or by both sides getting exhausted. But the point is that Russia still demands Ukraine's capitulation. And that is not something that President Zelensky can give into, because they have politics too. I think the best way to bring back peace is to help Ukraine to inflict enough damage on the Russian army to convince President Putin that what he has set out to do is undoable, is unwinnable.
Not just the US, Poland also has massively helped Ukraine militarily and financially. What kind of
not militarily, with military equipment.
With equipment, excuse me, yes, of course. And what kind of an impact can that have on the conflict? And how is the mood in Poland? Is there some, fatigue setting in at some point, or is there great enthusiasm about continuing to help?
We have poisonous politics in Poland too, but this is an issue on which the government and the opposition completely agree. There is a reason why we've taken in 3 million Ukrainian refugees, and we have not taken them to camps. We've taken them into our homes. I had 10 people in my home at one moment, and we still have them, while the Ukrainian men working in Poland actually went to fight. Poland has sent howitzers, has sent tanks, has sent anti-aircraft missiles, and will do more. Because we feel, and I know that there is a different feeling in Hungary, but in Poland we feel that if Putin conquers Ukraine, he'll come for us next. And so the Ukrainians are fighting our fight, and the least we can do is to protect their women and children.
And I think we understand that point of view here in Hungary. You have been threatened directly by the Russian government.
For the last 500 years, yes.
If I may, we were asked a question about what we see in the future, and I'm not speaking about what you saw yesterday or last week in Washington, D.C. And what I think is likely to happen if these trends continue that I was speaking of, it's very likely that the populations of places like Western Europe, Germany, France, especially as we enter winter and cold winter, but also the United States, are going to weary of this. And so there is a kind of race, in a sense, between who gets tired first. But I would say the following, that while you saw political figures in the United States strongly support the war in Ukraine, we are going to move very quickly from a set of congressional elections in November to a presidential election. It will change the next day. And if it's the case that there is waning support, especially among Republicans, for an open-ended commitment to Ukraine, the candidate who runs with a much more, let's say, willingness to say we have to limit our support for the Ukraine, is the candidate is going to be, along with other various positions that will appeal to the base, will change what is now the dominant position among the Republican elites to a very different one. In other words, I think there's a disconnect between the base and those who are in Washington, and when that disconnect becomes significant, a political figure will fill in. And so since we're entering a presidential season, I think you're likely to see that.
One more reply before we up the ante. And
I agree that the Democrats are now tougher on Russia, which is quite a reversal, isn't it? Bring us back the Republican Party of Ronald Reagan.
It's gone.
okay. So both sides have stated that this conflict will change the global world order. Russia has said the West is done. Joe Biden has said there will be a new world order led by America. So which is it to be? Maybe Professor Deneen.
I think we're already experiencing and seeing a new world order, but it's not going to be American-led. It will be significantly influenced by America, of course. But it seems to me that we have already passed the point where America could simply say, this is what we wish to see happen in the world. And this is, of course, because of both the relative rise of China in particular, but also rising economies elsewhere in the world and realignments that are taking place. BRICS, of course, is a significant realignment. Also the declining sort of financial hegemony of the United States, right? So the beginnings of the end of the petrodollar and the beginning of the end of an American-led banking system, the international financial system. So I think Joe Biden was correct that we are going to see a new world order, but it's going to be a different order. And I don't necessarily think it's going to be worse. I realize this may be sacrilegious for an American to say this, but America being the hegemon has had significant domestic costs. So as an American, I find myself in a position in which I think being less saddled with or responsible with the view that we have to in some ways run the world will be better for us as a country. It has been in some ways one of the destructive aspects of being an empire. As we know from the history of the world, being an empire is actually ends up being usually pretty bad for the citizens of that empire, because it leads to internal corruption, again, the rise of a class of people who benefit from that empire, as well as a kind of decay of republican and democratic institutions, as we know from Roman history. And I think there are many people who see, let's say, the reappearance of a multipolar world, not only as a sort of a natural consequence of the sort of just the nature of the world that we live in. And nations are going to have relatively higher influence in their areas and their spheres, but that it would be beneficial for the American Republic if we in some ways had a more modest view in terms of our role in global politics, which includes cognizance and even recognition that there are other powers in the world that have to be in some ways listened to, if not always agreed with, but nevertheless listened to and negotiated with.
Not sure how good that would be for Europe if America just goes out the back door.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it's retreating. And in fact, I think there will remain a very strong relationship between America and Europe, but that will be the regional relationship. It's not that it's going to be necessarily simply calling the tune for every nation in the world.
All right. Mr. Sikorski.
I agree that the unipolar moment has passed. It lasted about 20 years. It was unusual, actually. It was an exceptional outcome of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And America invested first, the first Gulf War, remember? 45 nations rallied round because the cause was just. And then the repeat, the Iraq War, was, I'm afraid, a misinvestment of American resources, political capital, and credibility. $3 trillion is a lot of money. And it wasn't worth it. And there are consequences to that. But I don't think Russia can benefit from that, because I think President Putin has made an even more catastrophic error by invading Ukraine. We thought he had a first-class army. I think he thought he had a first-class army, and now we see that he just had some elite units, and the rest is a 20th century army that he inherited from the Soviet Union. And he is largely losing it now. And he will not be in a position to rebuild it, let alone build a 21st century army. So a country with the economy the size of Italy has just basically destroyed one of its two export industries. Russia was a huge exporter of armaments. Would you buy Russian equipment now? I wouldn't. And it's in the process of destroying its oil and gas industry by playing political games with the supplies. Yes, we will have a hard winter, but we will then decouple ourselves from Russian oil and gas. And it'll cost us, but it'll eventually cost Russia even more. And as regards China, at the moment they still look inexorable, but nothing lasts forever. You know, every infrastructure-driven boom eventually ends with a debt crisis. So events can still save American leadership and America's position. But I'm glad you mentioned it. That America's withdrawal from the world would be terrible for us, because at the moment successive presidents, including President Trump, have urged us to spend more on our own defense. Finally, we are beginning to do it, but it's going to take 10 to 20 years to build up our defenses. And we don't know whether if there is a problem in the Far East and America is engaged somewhere else, we would be defenseless right now. So we need two insurance policy. We need to maintain strong relations with the United States, but we need also to bear some of the burden of leadership by protecting at least our southern periphery. This should not be beyond our capabilities. You know, as regards deterring Russia, I think we will need the US for that for the foreseeable future.
You've mentioned the economic consequences for Russia. You've mentioned the decoupling, European decoupling of the Russian raw materials, energy. I wonder, is that a settled fact? There have been sanctions ever since 2014 against Russia, and Russia grew strong enough with these sanctions to attack Ukraine. And have we actually studied the effects of the sanctions that we introduced now? Are we confident that we know the consequences of our actions?
Sanctions always cut both ways. There's no easy way of doing sanctions that create fast results without costing you, by the very nature of trade. And I agree with you. Russia imposed counter-sanctions, for example, on the export of our food, and now has an export agriculture industry. But they were not able to import certain high grades of steel, which is why some of their equipment doesn't work. They were not able to import, and are not going to be able to import high-quality chips. And you can't have precision munitions without chips. This will have consequences, but not immediately. I couldn't agree with you more, though, that sanctions should be intelligent. They should harm those that we want to sanction more than us. We should have done much earlier. We should have sanctioned the individuals much more broadly that were responsible for the annexation of Crimea. We should have sanctioned Russia already in 2013 when they imposed a trade embargo on Ukraine for daring to negotiate a free trade agreement with the European Union. And we pretended that that was a bilateral issue between Ukraine and Russia. It wasn't. It was all to do with Ukraine wanting to become European.
Now, so we have 7 minutes left, so let's keep that in mind in our answers. Are Western values necessary for economic success? Or can autocratic political systems become more modern than the aging old democracies? Professor Deneen.
Well, when we say Western values, what do we mean? What values of the last 50 years?
You go and tell us.
No, it's an odd question because, of course, the West has been defined by many different economic systems. So I think what underlies your question is a kind of assumption that we've certainly seen over the last maybe 50 years, of that the future, to refer back to Francis Fukuyama, the future is essentially a global, open economic order of free markets in which goods and people flow freely across what were once notional borders, and in which we would see basically the sort of endless material and even moral progress of humanity as a result of this openness. And I think, if anything, what we are seeing now today is the end of that set of assumptions, and indeed the end of that set of practices. We're undergoing really a form of deglobalization, not an increase of globalization. We are experiencing it in just the ways that was just mentioned as a result of the pandemic, but also I think political pressures of what I was mentioning earlier about the decline of the status and the condition of the working class, the demand for the reintroduction of manufacturing, that simply the calculus should not be finding the cheapest place to produce goods, but that is a matter of political stability and for the good of creating a middle-class society, which is essential. There's an Aristotelian value for you. That's as old as you get in the West, just about. Aristotle says a society that does not have a strong middle class is a society that would be riven by civil war. So economic considerations, of course, are important. But what underlies any of those assumptions is whether your political society can be healthy politically. And of course, it needs a sufficient economic base. But it can't just be an economic base that's neglectful of the condition of the citizens in that society. So this deglobalization has been already happening. It's been accelerated in some ways by the experience of COVID and the need to secure sort of essential industries in one's country. And now we've seen the shattering of what was once the sort of the almost orthodox religious assumption of globalization, which is if you had a McDonald's in every country, in every city, this was the sign that liberal democracy would be there forever. This was the end of history. Well, McDonald's just left Moscow. It turns out that this assumption of globalization was proven not to be the case, and the return of national interest, which never went away, as it turns out, is in some ways deeper and more profound than the assumptions of globalization.
Mr. Sikorski.
I agree, as I said before, that we took a bet that if we admit China into WTO and we grant them the market economy status, that they will play by agreed rules, and we lost that bet. And we have to draw conclusions. But my fear, and the new buzzword in Washington, I'm sure you know, is friend-shoring. So bringing back some production either to your own shores or to a friendly country where you can be sure of access. But I fear to give an answer to your question at a more fundamental level. Because you lived in Hungary, I lived in Poland, right? So we lived under centrally managed economies where they didn't work because essentially the price mechanism didn't work. Price mechanism in a free economy sends the signals. It's an information system, in fact. It sends the signals to producers as to what consumers want to buy and at what price. And you can then match the two, right? And in a planned economy, the planners essentially had spun the prices out of their own heads, and it didn't work. And they didn't have enough computing power at the center to make a centrally planned economy work. What I fear is that today the authoritarians do have enough computing power. They can follow, for example, in China, the government follows social media. It's a kind of substitute for democracy. They receive signals of displeasure, of discontent, and they try to do it. And they have enough data about their citizens, their preferences, what they watch, what they buy, and so on, that maybe they have an advantage now over a dispersed system of sharing information. This is what worries me.
Why does it worry you, though?
Because that would mean that we would become poorer and China would become the center and we would become the periphery. And I would not like to see that because I like Western civilization.
But if you have to put your money on what's actually going to happen, will it happen?
No, because in the end, there are cracks and problems within the Chinese economy, within or centrally economy run by where the party interest is paramount, that I think will show themselves. For the last 10 years, they've been investing in unproductive stuff. This has to eventually have consequences.
Okay, now both of you get like 30 seconds for your closing remarks. You can either answer my question or whatever you have on your mind, but the place of the United States in the world in 50 years' time. Professor Deneen.
30 seconds.
35.
35. The United States will continue to be an extremely important nation, right? It can produce most of the goods that it needs, many of the goods that it needs for its own consumption as well as export. It has the only military at the moment that can fight theoretically 2 wars, but at least 1 war anywhere in the world. And it's of course it's a growing society, but I do think that we are entering a new time in which America is going to have to learn what it is to be a more humble nation, and that will be the challenge for America in the next 50 years.
The place of Poland and Europe in the world in 50 years.
You reminded me when John Paul II died. I was in Washington, I was watching CNN, and the interviewer was interviewing a cardinal. So, do you think he's with Jesus? We have 30 seconds.
Yes.
Poland.
Yes, the answer.
Poland has the economy to become a member of the G20, and together with its Visegrad neighbors and partners, we should be an important pole of influence inside a European Union that is not a super state but a superpower.
Future of the V4, I give you an extra 10 seconds. Still around in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, Visegrad cooperation?
Provided we use Visegrad cooperation for the things that we agree on. Legacies to do with communism, of industry, of our interest in infrastructure building, and we don't use it for the things that we disagree on. Such as clearly deterring Russia, because then you break the instrument.
So as long as we don't fight. Good. Well, thank you,
Sounds
gentlemen.
like also a good analysis for the European Union as well.
Exactly. Thank you, gentlemen, for your insights. It was a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot. I would say Esztergom will still be here in 50 years' time, and we will still be having our Feszt. Thank you very much.